Okay, got my recording going. So I'm gonna share. Heather, if you could let me know if you can see the screen. Can you see the PowerPoint?
Not yet.
Is it there? Do you see it?
Nope.
No?
Nope.
Okay.
Not
Was
yet.
having this problem yesterday. And-
It looks like you're starting to share. There we go. Got
Okay,
it.
perfect. Okay, so thank you for joining. This is a quick sort of FAQ on NAGPRA and compliance. So today we'll be talking about NAGPRA compliance and ethical practices. The agenda will go, who does NAGPRA apply to, defining cultural affiliation, how we define certain language as it relates to NAGPRA practices. NAGPRA has some really specific definitions that can be a little difficult to navigate, and so I'd love to talk about those. How the Plains Indian Museum approaches is working with communities, and then what board members can do to support this work. So as we start, I want to just make a note about this specific picture that I wanted to include. And so when we work with tribal delegations, it's important that we are learning as much as we possibly can when tribal communities are willing to offer information, are willing to offer details about their communities and their practices. And so I started looking at my pictures and I came across this image and it was a really nice memory. And so this is a selection of Blackfoot moccasins. And we had a Blackfoot delegation at one point who came in and they wanted to see different types of footwear. And I started sitting there listening, and it was really interesting because they were sharing a lot of different details specifically about these design elements. And so if we take a look at this pair of moccasins that are yellow and on the far left, it's an excellent example of a quilled, porcupine quilled set of moccasins. And what was interesting was they explained that the floral design on there is actually a depiction of a tobacco plant. The next was really interesting because they pointed at these two pairs of hourglass moccasins. And so up here on the left corner is the blue pair, and then we have a pink pair on the bottom right corner. And it was interesting because they started talking about the knowledge gained around that specific design. And so for us, it looks like an hourglass. But to the Blackfoot people, they would depict this symbol as the way they would round up a buffalo before they would send them off of a cliff during cliff jumps. And so you can see this circular area is how the bison would herd, and then then they would push them across. And I thought that was a really, really interesting detail. And then finally, up here in the far right, the white moccasins actually represent a serpent symbol. And so the serpent has specific meaning in one of their societies. And so had we not sat down and sort of had that firsthand experience, I mean, I wanted to talk about this specific image because I think it really shows the impact of how important it is to have communities because we can get on the ground insight in our consultation practices. So when we talk about NAGPRA, NAGPRA is this acronym that is often thrown around in culture communities, in communities in the federal government. And so NAGPRA stands for the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. It was an act that was implemented in law in 1990. And it is a set of resources that provides access for tribal communities to repatriate their items back. And so NAGPRA is pretty clear about how they define what items can be returned. And those include human remains, funerary objects, sacred objects, and objects of cultural patrimony. And so NAGPRA is also really clear about the specific communities that can repatriate. And so those are lineal descents, Indian tribes, and Native Hawaiian organizations. And so later on in the presentation, we'll do sort of a definition breakdown of those specific groups and how NAGPRA applies to those communities. And so NAGPRA is a lot of things. And I think what's really interesting when you consider policies that support tribal communities. They're either laws that are federal Indian law, or they apply to property law, or they're human rights laws. NAGPRA is all three of those elements. It's a human rights law, it's a property law, and it's federal Indian policy. And so there could be a lot of success with NAGPRA, but then that can also sort of complicate some of the situations. So when we are considering how NAGPRA applies and who it applies to, we have to really take a critical look at the way that NAGPRA recognizes specific communities. And so NAGPRA is a law that is used in government-to-government interactions. And so it is meant to give leverage and authority to tribal communities when they are working with institutions to either build a relationship around the collections that are held in those communities, or that specific government power to receive their items back in that sovereign role. And so in that case, that's where you would see the human rights element. And so a tribal community that wants to repatriate an item has to either fall under these three designations. So NAGPRA supports the request from lineal descents. Those are individuals who have an uninterrupted ancestry to a person. So say there is a item that is in a federal repository. This community member can say, this is my ancestor, and I can trace my ancestry through these ways. The next is how NAGPRA defines a tribal community. And so these are definitions directly out of the NAGPRA policy. A tribe is any organized community, band, or nation that receives special programs and services from the United States government. And they're eligible for those services. And so that is how the federal government defines an Indian tribe. And lastly, there's also been a lot of work to sort of understand how the government recognizes Native Hawaiian organizations. So the Office of Hawaiian Affairs is doing a lot of work to guarantee that they are recognizing their community members, and their community members are organizing because they do not live in reservation systems or operate in a semi-sovereign capacity in Hawaii. So NAGPRA is really clear about who its subject matter is. And so NAGPRA only applies to organizations that receive federal funds. And so those are museums, those are universities, those are cultural institutions, those are the federal government, right? So we have our federal partners, including the those that fall under the interior, those that are managed by the National Park Service, Bureau of Indian Affairs, Shoshone National Forests, so on and so forth, so federal agencies. But NAGPRA does not apply to, nor are these communities eligible to use NAGPRA for repatriation. And those include state-recognized tribes, unrecognized tribes, indigenous communities from the U.S. territories. And so those would be indigenous communities like the Chamorro of Guam, the Taino people of Puerto Rico, or other indigenous Pacific Islanders. So like American Samoa, those are indigenous communities, but they do not have power to use NAGPRA. Lastly, are Canadian First Nations. And NAGPRA does not cover, which is an important distinction, the regulation of private collectors or collections, institutions that do not receive federal funds, or the Smithsonian. But that said, the Smithsonian institutions have their own repatriation policies, and that act was actually implemented in 1989. So under NAGPRA, NAGPRA is really clear about the distinction in defining cultural affiliation. And so I wanted to take this opportunity to sort of point to an experience that we had in February here at the Plains Indian Museum. We invited the Mandan Hidatsa Narikara Interpretive Center to come through and view collections, and they were able to help us identify a number of Mandan Hidatsa and Arikara items, and hopefully within the next year or two we'll be able to do a long-term loan or make the case for deassessing and gifting items to the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara people so that they can grow their collection. And so when we define cultural affiliation, it really stems down to making sure that we are talking with source communities. And so under NAGPRA, NAGPRA has some really clear distinctions of how an organization can identify cultural affiliation. And these are often used, these terms specifically are cultural affiliation and culturally unidentifiable are used around the identification of human remains specifically. And so NAGPRA defines a cultural affiliation as a community or a group that shares, that has a shared identity and can trace their ancestry from past to present. And so those includes tribal communities in the 50 states, but including Native Hawaiian organizations. And they do that through multiple means. And so you can have consultation, you can consider lineage, geographical or kinship relationships to land. And it could be used through folklore traditions like linguistics, oral history, historical or historical data and oral history as well. And so when we're looking at this concept around identifying cultural affiliation, they use this a lot of times to identify human remains. And so human remains, if that information has been passed down, you know what tribe that community is, then there's this distinction. But if they're culturally unidentifiable, there is a way under NAGPRA that a tribe can assume responsibility for the culturally unidentified remains, and then they can be transferred. So that's an important piece. So NAGPRA covers 5 areas under repatriation. And so when a tribe puts in a request, there's 5, I guess, means that they can repatriate under. And so I just want to like talk over those definitions because it's important to understand sort of the distinction when we are reading NAGPRA claims. And so first and foremost, a lot of NAGPRA policies have been focused currently on defining and clarifying the repatriation of human remains. And so that has been a focus, especially over the last 3 iterations of NAGPRA. And so NAGPRA has had 6 updates to it. The most recent being in 2024, 2023, 2024. And so under NAGPRA and how historical communities understand that definition is a human remain is the whole or partial skeletal remain of an ancestral human that was once living. And so included as a human remain could be bone, it could be teeth, it could be tissues, naturally shed tissues like umbilical cords and hair. And so under NAGPRA, it's important to understand if there is a cultural affiliation or if they have been identified as culturally unidentifiable. Under NAGPRA and how we understand it, funerary objects are objects that were placed with the deceased individual at the time of their death or as part of the death rite ceremony. And so this is an important distinction. Those items are considered the personal property of the individual. And so when they have been identified and they remain with the individual at the time of excavation, then they must be returned with the individual during the repatriation process. So NAGPRA has 2 definitions of funerary objects. And so this is an important distinction, especially as we consider why 90% of all human remains are in cultural institutions and museums. The biggest reason is because of the advancement of the highway system. And so when the United States highway system was built, it was the case that there was a lot of displacement of individuals and their remains. And from that instance, what would happen is there might have been the displacement of a human and they would have funerary objects. Some objects would go with the ancestor in its next resting place, either at a cultural institution, or the individual would go to one institution and then their funerary objects would go to another institution. Well, under NAGPRA, that is how they define unassociated funerary objects. And so when we make this distinction, we have to understand that an associated funerary object was those items placed with the individual at the time of death and remained with the individual during excavation. Unassociated items were those same items that were placed with the ancestor and the human remains, but after excavation, they were displaced from that individual, and they now are the personal property, are the property of an institution. And so if a tribe is putting in a request and they have identified a secondary location where the unassociated funerary objects are, they actually have to put in two separate NAGPRA claims, although those items belong to that one individual. And so we've talked about the three of the five definitions that a community can repatriate under. The next are a sacred item and an item of cultural patrimony. And so for a long time, I sort of had a difficulty deciphering the two, because we understand that items inherently are sacred to communities. But NAGPRA has really clear definitions of how they define sacred items and items of cultural patrimony. So a sacred item is a specific object that is necessary for religious use by a spiritual leader. And these can be defined as personal property. So I use the example of in POD or Native American church practices, a practitioner may use a fan and a staff. These are items that are used for that religious purpose, but they are personally owned. An item of cultural patrimony is an object that has historic, traditional, or cultural importance, and it's ongoing. And so these items, when used, their use benefits the entire tribe in that community. And they can be entrusted to one single caretaker, but under the definition of cultural patrimony, that caretaker is not the owner. And so NAGPRA uses these two claims, are these 2 points. An item of cultural patrimony cannot be used and are alienated or appropriated by any one person. And their uses cannot be separated from a community. And so at the Plains Indian Museum, we've seen NAGPRA requests, and it's oftentimes a lot more successful for a community to put in a NAGPRA claim under this definition of items of cultural patrimony, because a tribe can demonstrate that its ongoing use will benefit multiple people. It's a lot harder unless a community uses that lineal descent method to repatriate a sacred item because they were considered personal property. But it can't be undone, right? Like that there is successful cases where you see that. And so the repatriation process is not a quick or sometimes efficient process, unfortunately. I mean, in my professional opinion, it seems to be the case with a lot of government policies. But if we understand the repatriation process, there is about five, I would say, like methods that you go about for a successful repatriation. And so in my experience, a successful repatriation can take 18 months. An unsuccessful and sort of repatriation that's riddled with challenges can take up to 4 or 5 years. And so that can be a little discouraging when you're working with communities, and they may also have leadership changes, or if they have been consulting with elder communities and their elders pass. And so when we're thinking along the lines of returning items to communities, we also want to think about the efficiency and being able to get that done the best way that we can. So a successful repatriation will follow these five goals. First and foremost, a source community will reach out to the center and they will ask us to create a list or a summary or an inventory that helps identify an inventory specifically to their nation. Once a community or a tribal historic preservation officer asks for that, then they will come back to us and they will request an on-site visit. At that point, it's our responsibility to provide copies of all the documentation related to the specific items that they want to see. And so that process is called the consultation process. And I will talk about, some of the methodologies that we go about with a successful consultation. Once a community has left, then and they decide that they want to put a claim in, they will write up their proposal, they'll send it back to us, and then it's our responsibility to review the different elements included in that claim. And so we do our due diligence by providing as much resources as we can, documentation, so that they can provide a healthy claim. Once it goes through the process here at the center and we decide, yes, this is absolutely an item that we should repatriate under NAGPRA, and it's approved, then we will submit to the National NAGPRA office what's called a notice of intent to repatriate. And so this is what triggers a 30-day waiting period once that notice hits the National Register. And if there is no counterclaims that comes through, and in that 30-day period from when that NIR is posted, then that item now belongs to that tribal community or those Hawaiian communities or individuals. And then at that point, then we transfer control and possession. Because we have to consider, right, that NAGPRA is also property law. And so with the repatriation process, we are changing the property from the quote unquote ownership of the item that we have here into the hands of a community. What's important to know about this process is it's not for us as museum professionals, as board members, as trustees, to make a distinction about what is going to happen with that item once it leaves our possession. That is the full control and the care and responsibility and stewardship of that community. So something that we're really proud of at the Plains Indian Museum, and specifically the way that we've adopted this in the center, is guaranteeing that we are practicing what we preach in supporting tribal communities. And so that consultation piece is really important. It's our policy and our practices to make sure that we are treating our guest communities as a delegation, understanding that we're representing ourselves to them and they are representing their communities and they will go back to their communities and we want them to have good experiences. And so we lead, and this is really important because this is also part of our collections management process, cultural sensitivity policies, and we have a no destructive testing policy. And so that guarantees that we are not harming our collection and it's not being used for certain scientific purposes. When we work with tribal communities, and I'm glad to see that my colleague Heather Bender is on this call too, it's because we're intentional about making sure that we are providing consent and culturally informed interactions. And so these can be anything, including consideration for gender roles in handling practice, in our handling practices. We have worked with tribal communities and they have said, this item is not to be held or used by men, or vice versa. This item is only to be used by men, and women are not allowed to touch this, or certain biological processes. If we've had communities say if a woman is menstruating, we ask that they stay away from these during that time because they're so powerful during their period. And so when we get that knowledge, it's important for us to implement those asks and those requests. It's also important to seek advice from our advisors on specific protocols. If we have a question about best practices, like first and foremost, we go to our advisory board, or if we have connections within tribal communities, to go to our elders and ask, what's the best way to approach this? When we have communities on site, it's important that we lead with the visitor-led pace. And so we have to have considerations for physical and spiritual needs. It is our policy and our practice to encourage communities to reflect and to smudge and to pray. And, we've even taken requests for items for specific cultural items to be taken outside in the sun. We've had tribal communities ask if they can touch things with their bare hands, and we say absolutely, because they've expressed that it's important that they have physical touch. And so aside from our collections care, we also need to understand specific physical and spiritual care. Next is there's always this expectation that when we host a delegation, we sit down and share a meal, or we share coffee, or we have time to reflect. And so we have a lot more strength with working with tribal communities when we are making sure that we're resonating with their experiences, their values, and their emotions. And that helps us effectively communicate our specific needs. We also refrain from using ownership language. And so these are things like, I don't use words like this is my collection, or this is my museum, or these are our items, because the Plains Indian Museum are the stewards of these collections, right? That cultural knowledge belongs and can be better taken care of with those communities. And lastly, what's important is making sure that we're being consistent with our follow-up, understanding that, these are long-term relationships, and it's important for us to keep up with them, to have our ear to the ground and understand what's going on in tribal communities. And that's an important piece. I had a tribal elder tell me one time, she goes, we have a lot of responsibilities as communities, but we also know that when our items want to come home, they figure out a way. And I think that's a really beautiful way to sort of understand this relationship, is that like we are working with living, breathing communities. They have this belief system that these items that we are stewards of are living and breathing. And so they have autonomy. And I think that's a really beautiful piece to consider. So with this next slide, I sort of want to just throw out some numbers. This is data that we have compiled over a few years, just to sort of give those that are on viewing this presentation the scope of the collection care that we have. So right now we have an inventory of about 506 items that have explicitly been identified as sacred or ceremonial items that would be considered for NAGPRA if we received a request for them. We have 8 human remains. And so those include 3 full skeletons, one of which is a non-native individual, 2 skulls, and we have a few selections of partial bone or teeth fragments. The Plains Indian Museum houses a total collection of about 7,500 items. But we use this number sort of loosely because we have items that may have 1 or 2 parts. So 75 is sort of a good number to start with. Since 1993, and that date is important because that was the date that cultural institutions needed to provide summaries and inventories to tribal communities. And so since 1993 to the present, the Plains Indian Museum has acquired what we consider 186 activities. And so an activity is an important distinction because that can include one single item, or it can include a collection of items. And so basically, if we're thinking about it, it's 186 transactions sort of that the Plains Indian Museum had. But those include anything from gifts to purchases to estate and bequeaths. The Plains Indian Museum is also responsible for the national NAGPRA practices for the entire center. And so we have to consider that the Whitney Western Art Museum and the Buffalo Bill Museum are stewards of Indigenous collections. And so with that, we've identified 24 activities with under those institutions, and it's the same purchases, gifts, and bequeaths. So I get to the point is, how can advisors support this process? It's important for us to understand that like you all are advisors for a reason. And when you can offer insight and knowledge of the collection, that is a key element for us. It's a key role that you all have. It's connecting us with your networks and your tribal communities or in other institutions and seeing how they do their policies. The same could be said is using us as a resource for those institutions. It's important to lobby for funding with administration so that we can support hosting delegations, so that we can support applying for grants, elements like that. That goes to my next point. Advisors, your voices matter. And so when we choose to apply for certain grants to help us fund NAGPRA policies, writing a letter of endorsement, so we can include that in our application. Making sure that when you are asked, you can refer your networks to our NAGPRA page so that they know how to contact me. Another way that advisors can support this process is making the distinction and helping us clarify when NAGPRA may be appropriate or if there's another means like deaccession to get items in a tribal community. And so we work with quite a bit of tribal communities who are now, rather than going through the NAGPRA process because it can be quite slow, they are asking that institutions just deassess items if they don't think that there's going to be a counterclaim. And so I use the example of working with the Crow tribe. They will often first request that an institution consider deaccession because if they go through the NAGPRA process, there's no other tribe that is going to create a counterclaim because they are the only Crow tribe. And so when we are bringing up these ideas of deaccession or NAGPRA, just making the distinction that maybe NAGPRA is not the best method. Maybe there is another way that we can navigate returning items. And then next to that, and first and foremost, is also just enlisting colleagues to listen and provide feedback. So right here is a page, and it's just a screenshot of our NAGPRA statement that is on the website, the Plains Indian Museum website on the Buffalo Bill Center of the West. Right here, we have a specific NAGPRA email. It's nagpra@centerofthewest.org. And there, that is when communities can initiate a claim or if they want to learn more information or specifically how to contact me as the Center NAGPRA coordinator. And then right here, I've also included a slide, and this is directly out of our collections policy, our collections management policy on our sacred and culturally sensitive objects. And so I'll provide the slides for this presentation, and then you're welcome to read how the center works under this culturally sensitive objects policy. And so thank you for being here, and this is my information, and I would love to hear from any of you if you have any questions.
Well done.
Was that okay?
Yeah, it was great.